Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Um, this is the third talk in the consciousness engineering of the native mind, reclaiming the mystic. And this is really going to look at perhaps one of the most uncomfortable truths about this whole process. That colonization wasn't really about, or wasn't never simply about geography and economics. Obviously, that played a huge part in the empire and in their stealing of the wealth. But it was a multi-layered, deliberate project which was created over a period of time to re-engineer consciousness itself. And obviously, powers such as the empires that did this colonization discovered that human beings is easiestly, or the most easiest way to conquer a human being isn't through violence, but through belief. If you can replace being with becoming, if you can make people doubt their own inner experience, their inner knowing, you no longer need to rule them. They'll rule, or should I say, they will become enslaved to themselves. They will rule themselves through shame, through comparisons, through confusion. And the British colonization of India and Punjab in particular perhaps is the most sophisticated and refined psychological operations in human history. Why? Because Punjab was the crucible of mystics, the land of mystics, and particularly beyond the whole hierarchies from Manu's caste-based systems. And the purpose was basically to replace the mystic mind of experience with the religious mind of belief. What is called modernity, progress, civilization, education were and are in fact tools of an invisible project, the colonization of the very soul, the reprogramming of subjectivity, and the erasure, the removal of what I would call ontological literacy. You know, the nature of consciousness, the nature of being, the capacity to know reality through direct experience. So, how was this achieved? Well, in this presentation, what I want to try and do is to try and identify some of the areas that were employed in order to re-engineer the native mind. I call it the native mind at this stage. And perhaps what we want to work with first is, or shall look at, is that this wasn't just a ad hoc project. This was actually made, the conspiracy began in the parliament. And the conspiracy was very simple. That through the minutes of Thomas Mokele in 1835, and you can check this for yourself, the agenda was we must form a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. And this is really where it begins. This drafted document that changed the consciousness of the continent, the minutes on India education or Indian education. This wasn't an educational reform. It was a blueprint for colonization. The objective was very clear: to create an Indian elite that thought like Englishmen, saw the world through the British reductionist Abrahamic lens and logic, internalized Western moral superiority, and it deliberately replaced indigenous ontologies, experiential sciences of consciousness with Western dualism. And this dualism is grounded in guilt-ridden or guilt-based morality, education within a dualistic system, and an approach where materialism, objectivity is given far more credence and value than subjective experience. The Gurmat path of self-realization, which taught that truth is verified through unpov, through experience, was simply dismissed as mystical superstitions. Yeah. In its place came the culture of memorization, of intellectualization, of competition. Schools became factories of identities, producing minds fluent in English, but strangely, completely um, disconnected with a sense of self. And this is really where the first um, what I would call the psychological software was installed for this great reprogramming to begin, replacing indigenous consciousness with Western rationalism and moral guilt. So, how did it begin? Well, let's look at the missionary agenda. The missionary agenda was pretty simple. It was basically replacing mysticism with morality. Um, and here it started around 1830s in Ludhiana, and the Lahore missions were established by the British and the American, I think, Christian missionaries, Protestants in particular. Their goal was explicit: the conversion and the moralization of the native soul. Pretty much what you see today in Punjab as well. People like Reverend, I think Robert Clark was the name. Sikhism is incomplete without Christ. Such statements reveal the kind of arrogance this empire had within themselves, and they have it even to date. Just look around you. The belief that mystic wisdom of Nanak could be completed by theology. Missionaries targeted not only the belief system, but the very internal inner structure of experience. They translated mystic expressions such as Nam, the ontological resonance of and presence of this moment, or Hukam, or Shabad, into language of sin, redemption, law, obedience, labels, names. So all of this distortion in language was simply to translate the mystical experience into a knowledge based belief system. And the mystic was turned into a sinner, the seeker into a student of moral laws. So you were given titles, and you were given even just look at the clothes, how the clothing got changed. Even to date, people, whether they accept it or not, there is a preference for lighter skin than darker skin within communities. Where does this come from? Ask yourself, where does this come from? So this wasn't evangelism, it was psychological warfare. And the remarkable thing is, you are still in it right now. The mystical consciousness, rooted in direct knowing, was reframed as error, replaced by not just error, but as a pathology. People were fakirs, they were sadhus, they were the vagabonds. These were the people who were marginalized, individuals that didn't belong to social structures, and they were replaced with external dependencies. Paul looking at the church, the book, the preacher as your source of authority. And these conversions, these kind of imposition of this reductionist religious framework was very methodically organized, and it still is right to this very day. It still is simply reframing what is a living experiential way of being into this nonsense, belief-based nonsense. And by doing this, really, what they actually did was, by the late 19th century or so, it began to face a challenge in Punjab, where mystics, saints, and Bhagat lineage were too fluid to control, and therefore they needed some kind of a structure to maintain this or contain this fluidity. Because the teachings of the mystics transcended caste, creed, race, scripture, and therefore it was a unifying force. And really, the only way you can control society is through division. And you can see that now as well. You know, the whole divisions between gender, between the trans ideology, between races, between the haves and the have-nots, the constant division that is constantly being fueled. Just listen to any news, any mainstream propaganda echo chamber, and you will find they're talking about division. Are you for this or are you for that? So what the empire used was a far subtler weapon, which was to get the Sikhs to do the damage to themselves. And how was this done? Well, this was done through the Singh Sabha movement, which is around 1870s, 1873 onwards. And there are some amazing pieces of work by O'Brien and others, religious boundaries, etc., which provide a far detailed um, uh, insight, including Professor Arvinder Mende's work in this particular area. Although the Singh Sabha was initially a defensive reaction to the missionary activity to preserve the identity of the Sikh and Gurmat, however, this was gradually co-opted by British administrators, institutionalized into Sikh identity. And officials like Max Arthur McAuliffe translated systematic Sikh thought through the lens of Christianity. Excuse me. And this is very similar. I mentioned this in the previous talk, where when Trump, particularly Ernest Trump, came into contact and translation of Guru Granth Sahib Ji, the Ik Oankar couldn't be comprehended as this present moment unfolding continuously as consciousness in motion, which is known as Hukam. So it was translated into Ik, one God. Um, and in this, in Mawcliffe's work in terms of the Sikh religion, it's a phenomenal piece of work, well worth having a look at it. Guru Nanak was presented not as a mystic who realized the oneness of being, but as a monotheistic reformer, the founder of Sikh religion or Sikhism, akin to Moses or Luther. Um, Hukam, which is this dynamic, ontological, intelligent order of consciousness in motion right now, became God's command. So do you see how the language was shifted from an experiential space into this authoritarian paradigm? The inner illumination of awareness became a prophet. This how would I define this? A kind of a capturing of the mystics within a scriptural space froze Gurmat into a religion, basically. It shifted it from this experiential, ontological, to this belief-based theology. And even today, you know, you're going to ask people, you know, what's your definition of being a Sikh, for example? They say, oh, I believe in the Guru Granth Sahib. I believe in the Gurus. I believe in this and I believe in that. Well, you can understand that even today, these individuals are basically the continuation and the reinforcement of that same colonization, where priests, rituals, hierarchies were brought into the worldview of the Sikh, where there wasn't any of this, where rules became very tight, very stringent, dogma, doctrine, boundaries. And remember, wherever there's a boundary, there's always a conflict. That's just the nature of how this works. So the Singh Sabha movement followed through the translations of the the authorities of Guru Nanak as a worldview and the Sikh way of being through these translators who really had a Protestant and a Christian lens, couldn't see anything else, and therefore the gurus became prophets and hukam became so the empire understood that control depends on measurement. So they invented a new tool, the census of India. And this, I think, was around the 1800s or so, 1890s, yeah, to early 1900s. And it divided this fluid Sant, Sufi, Bhagat lineage into fixed religions. And this was based on a race classification of Indians by skull and caste. And this is really a kind of the next stage from Manu's hierarchy of the caste system in India. Um, so this new tool was basically used, presented as a neutral bureaucracy, something that was in fact nothing more than just taking an account of what the population was, but in fact was a very, very sophisticated instrument of identity engineering. So this fluid mystical communities and lineage were forced into categories of a Hindu, a Muslim, a Sikh, and another. Yeah. So you can see how that which was bringing the whole thing together as a unified space that all were founded on presence and consciousness now became categorized into these various ways. And this categorization, which was based on this race theory or race classification, should I say, which was determined by the skull shape, from what I can remember, nasal index, I think that was another one. Although through these kind of pseudo scientific classifications, people were reprogrammed to think of themselves not as consciousness, but as categories. So even now, you will find people, well, I'm a Sikh, I'm not a Hindu. I'm a this, I'm not a that. Again, categorization, self-imposition, self-limitation. The self became static and still is. Belonging became more important than being. This gave uh, this kind of process really gave birth to this collective ego or hankar at cultural scale. It wasn't no longer about individual hankar. It now became a national, a cultural, a communal hankar. And that was exploited during the time of the Raj. Just look at the partition. Just look at the partition where communities lived together for many, many years, how quickly it descended. Look at Rwanda, look at Uganda, look at Bosnia. You will find the same playbook being used over and over again, and it's always the same hand. Whether you see it or not, doesn't make any difference. So while each group was being defined as a separate group from another, what happens is you create boundaries. And once you create boundaries, you create conflict. What the mystics had once brought to the world, particularly with the profound wisdom of Guru Nanak, Ik Oankar, yeah, um, this one slogan of we are all one became we are all different. Very easily identified individuals as separate categories, and through separate categories classified themselves not as human beings, but as a race, a creed, or a community as such. Perhaps the most powerful weapon that was used was language, because language is the architecture of consciousness. Change the language and you change the experience of reality itself. This is how simple it is. And by imposing a language, and even now you will find that the national language of India is Hindi, even in Punjab, which is quite interesting. You will find that the same situation is done in a different way. So by changing language, you change experience, you change reality itself. So rather than having this word ik oankar, let's give the word God. Let's replace it with the word God. Rather than having Nam as presence, Akan Oka Sacha now. It's there. It is ineffable. It can only be experienced. Yes, Nam has a spectrum. On one side you have the gross recitation, Gurmantar, Bij Mantar. You have that on one side, which is um, uh, the gross side of the spectrum, and then as it gets deeper and deeper and deeper, we get to presence, through silence, stillness, etc. And your guru became your teacher. Remember, teachers are not as valuable as masters. There's a big difference. Yeah, big difference. And by replacing the original terms um, which had a resonance with them. So let me explain this. Like, for example, the word Akal Purakh, timeless consciousness, represents a sacredness in that word itself. We utter that word, and there is a recognition of sacredness and qadr in that word, in how it's used. And the nearest word within the English language that can be used is the word consciousness. The word consciousness. While consciousness points to the same thing, you will find that the secular word consciousness doesn't have the same halo effect as the word Akal Purakh. But when I'm talking about consciousness, I am actually speaking about Akal, timeless, undifferentiated consciousness, which is a spectrum. So the missionaries and the Orientalists systematically mistranslated sacred words to fit into Christian categories. And therefore, words in Sanskrit, in Persian, in Gurmukhi, in Arabic, in various other languages, and you will know that in the Guru Granth Sahib, there is a whole range of languages that have been used. Well, they've all been kind of categorized into similar words. So the word Ram, Gobind, Gopal, well, you'll find most of these words have been translated as the word Lord. Yeah, demonstrate how sacred words were mistranslated, and I would say quite deliberately, in order to fit into Christian theologies and Christian worldviews. So Nam, which has a kind of vibrational, ontological meaning, became nothing more than a label, and it still is. People still see it as that, even though if you look at Sukhmani Sahib, in particular, for example, and its explanation of the attributes of Nam, for example, or through the Guru Granth Sahib, which has the word Nam appear probably 4,500, 5,000 times, you will find the attributes provided around that particular word are profoundly different from the translations that we get in at the moment. So Shabad, rather than this creative pulse, became the word of God. Also translated as hymns, I've heard. So reducing this cosmic vibration to basically mere text. See the difference? Where Shabad is that which resonates through all, Oankar is the primary Shabad through which Nam is then experienced. It's been replaced as a word, as a hymn. So again, through languages of rhythm and resonance were replaced by grammar, linear grammar, abstraction. Yeah, just completely shifting the world view. Um, I think the word I would use is linguistic disembodiment. People began speaking words without feeling their vibration. In Gurmat terms, say Shabad Surt, the unity of sound and consciousness, was basically severed as a result of it. So this speech in itself began to transform. Meanings drifted from the being language and became the colonizers' most silent and effective weapon. But if that wasn't enough, oh, they went a stage further and still is. And I mentioned this earlier on, the whole idea of lighter skin over darker skin. Whether you educate, why do people run to Britain? Yeah, because this has been fused in them, that this is where the streets are paved with gold. This is where the civilized live. This is where everything is the heart of civilization and authority and theology. This is where it resides, although, the Vatican plays its own role in that. So the colonial control is sustained then not just through the language, through categorization, but let's go a stage further. And this is to do with inferiority and shame. Yeah. Once you convince people that their culture is backwards, their skin inferior, and their spiritual practices primitive, well, you don't need to do much. They will police themselves. Textbook sermons labeled yogis as lazy, yogis as ignorant, mystics and saints believing in superstition, metaphysics. Even today, I am surprised when I come across so-called Sikh academics and how they are allergic to this word consciousness, mysticism, ontology, and metaphysics. And they will defend everything that they have in order to reclassify and categorize what is an experiential way of being into these religious classifications. Western manners and dress became symbols of civilization. Have a look around you. And thank God for the Nahang tradition. Thank God for the Nahang tradition that they maintained their sovereignty. They maintained their lineage. They maintained their maryada. They maintained their lifestyle. And and even if you go now, although the Nahang phenomena has been kind of becoming more mainstream now, but you speak to most of the mainstream Singh Sabha reformists, you will find that the Nahangs are normally categorized in quite insulting terms, to say the least, and perhaps again demonstrating how the mystics have always been marginalized. So by creating this inferiority complex within them, it's easy. It's easy to allow them to see themselves in this reductionist, guilt-ridden, always trying to please the authority kind of psychology. Cleanliness was redefined as wearing shoes and suits. Yeah. Holiness was measured by accent and table manners, not by the aura that one presents. So you find this systematic humiliation created this internalized inferiority. What post-colonial psychology call colonial trauma is in fact split consciousness into two. The outer performing in acceptability, the inner self carrying unprocessed shame, guilt, and inferiority. In Gurmat, obviously, Homme is the root cause of your illness. And rather than recognizing how this Homme and Hankar, and one of the talks I will do will be how these different aspects of the mind were manipulated, if anyone's interested in it. But this it actually became a Homme empire. What the colonial did was they focused on that very thing that Guru Nanak demonstrated, evidentially has demonstrated through any mystic, is the root cause of human suffering. How may Dira grow? It's the root cause. But this root cause was actually amplified. It was amplified and then split in two. And this is how the dualism works. There is God and there is devil. So you bring persona and shadow. And therefore, and this persona and shadow, the shadow was to do with you are in inferior culture, you don't know the language, you closed your eyes, they gave you a book and they took your jewels and your gold. And why? Because this idea of your inferiority made you subservient to the masters. Once shame enters your inner space, awareness no longer trusts its own light. You begin to doubt yourself. So the colonized mind becomes a prison which becomes its own prison warden as well, in another word. But if this wasn't enough, let's move further. Let's move into the academia. How academia to this day is controlled. And it is controlled so rigidly that even our great Sikh scholars are afraid to touch mysticism. Why? Because they will be, I guess they will be identified or targeted. It is not necessarily acceptable to speak about such things. So we have to enter it through the language of consciousness. And consciousness, since some of the work with David Chambers a few, maybe 20, 25 years, 30 years ago, something defined as the hard problem. And the hard problem is this: they're trying to prove that consciousness is an epiphenomena of the brain. What does that mean? That the brain produces consciousness. This is just nonsense, right? This is just nonsense. This is like saying that a piece of software can become sentient and conscious. It just doesn't work. The brain is an organ. The brain is, analogy I can give you is, the brain is like a radio which can pick up the signal, consciousness being the signal, and once the signal is picked up, the brain modulates it. So that's your individualized jivatma, let's call it that. Yeah. So um, this this idea of placing academia now as the authority, remember, it's the same framework where the Brahmin is at the top of the hierarchy, then you have the Khatris, and then you have the farmers, and then you have the Shudra. Well, this is very similar in the academic world. So the academics are always the Brahmins of the colonizers. They're the ones who will tell you what is right and what is wrong. They are the ones that will uh, provide you with what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. So Orientalist scholars reinterpreted Eastern mysticism through biblical metaphors, right? Vedas became Old Testaments, gurus became prophets and founders. Sacred science was reframed as comparative religions. Check this out, man. I mean, it is so obvious when you see it, that you begin to recognize where you yourself have been a victim of this colonial psychological psychocolonization is the word I use. Um, and if we were to look at a summary, the machinery that was used, you will find through education, it was about dependency, through religion, it was about shame, through laws, it was about colonial acts. I mean, even the Anand Carriage is an act that was, from what I can remember, that was instigated and institutionalized through the colonial administrators. Um, And the census obviously gave you your fixed identities, and these fixed identities are working to this very day. Even within the Sikhs, you have gurdwaras that are built upon these fixed identities. And obviously, through language, you retranslate words that have sacred meaning into non sacred, ambiguous terms, suppress your inner experience, create this level of detachment or disconnection or disembodiment. And obviously, with the shame and reward, you are rewarded if you wear a suit and a tie and you go and you speak the right language and you use the manners and you know how to use fork and knives. You are then rewarded. But if you go there in your kurta pajama and you've just been making your turka the day before, you will find those very people who feel chicken masala tikka is the best thing since sliced bread, would look down on you. So you can see how this whole internalized control, how this was all internalized as a control system such that you became dependent. Now, I have spoken so far just to do with kind of the historical narrative to a degree, just to give you an insight of what's going on. But I would urge you to go and do some more research. Happy to put some references at the end of this for you to go and look into this. And you'll find that, pretty much what I've done is perhaps just scratching the surface. However, what I would like to bring to your attention now is that this hasn't stopped. This has continued. It has continued. It continues today through your digital home, your avatars, your becoming the influencer, becoming the celebrity, whether it's online, offline. It is simply the exaggerated continuation of your home and your hankar. And how is this achieved now? Well, this is achieved through its evolution, where it's no longer about language and culture, etc., because we're already in it. So it doesn't matter. So now it's about algorithms, it's about narratives, it's about identities. Just look at what's been happening with this whole trans ideology. And that will tell you, that gives you a living, real time colonization of groups of people, particularly children. Certainly if you look in the Americans, how that is being cultivated within individuals. So the colonized mind is maintained through a number of different ways. Education without awareness. Yeah, education without awareness. Learning facts without knowing really what you are in yourself. Yes, you can be a phenomenal academic and have written PhDs on X, Y, and Z, but if you don't know yourself, you've lost the game. That's it. Because Gurmat is clear as it with everything else, even in Christianity. Be still and know the kingdom is within. Yeah, man tu jyot swarup apna mool pachan. Same. All paths point to the same direction, and the direction is always in. The only way out is in. Belief without being, religion as a ritual, not resonance. Just think how often we attend these places, what we go and what we do. What is it? Is it a social kind of place to meet together, or is it somewhere where you can move in? In fact, are the teachings that are being delivered to you, whether it's to katha, whether it's to kirtan. Yep, the kirtan is always very engaging and the tunes are very good and the rags are very good. But really, is the message being delivered? Are you able to observe? Is man ko koi khojo pai? Bande khoj dil har roj? That are you able to see what the mind is about? Do you even know the components of your mind? Well, if the Guru Granth Sahib Ji was to be looked upon in terms of its content, you will find 80% of it is psycho-spiritual. It's to do with your inner space. But if you don't know the inner architecture, then even knowing about the inner space becomes, at best, knowledge, but at worst, something that you have no understanding to apply to yourself, I guess. Um, so information overload, you will find, doesn't matter what program you watch, doesn't matter what channel you operate, you will find it's the same. Even the scripts on your news channels or so-called news channels are identical. Why? Because the worldview and the narrative and the colonization has to be maintained and reinforced over and over and over and over again. Yeah. Remember during the COVID days, there were always these figures about how many people had died of COVID. Well, why don't they do that with heart attacks? Why don't they do that with people with alcohol problems? Why don't they do that with people with strokes? Because that's going on right now. Right now. Why? Because the narrative needed you to be forced into a particular pathway. And remember, there are only two things that sell: fear and greed. Okay? So fear was provided through all of that narrative, and greed was the ones who were administrating the solution to you. Consumer addiction, look at it now. Yeah. Every so often, I mean, I don't need to go into that, but you can see it yourself, right? An absolute heartless exploitation. Gurmat uses the word kudrat to describe nature. Khuda harat. Khuda harat. That divine essence that is in control of itself, replicates itself. And yet, what respect is that? Just look at Punjab. Where have they gone? Where have the trees gone? And then you complain about floods. Strange. The exploitation of the colonized, the exploitation through colonization have been at every single level, not just the mind, but the environment, and has created those who were connected with existence, with nature, into this isolated, sterile individuals who are self-obsessed with power, with me. And then obviously the constant attack on your attention, whether it's through digital stuff, whether it is through false flags, whether it is through the endless carnage that is being propagated and then shoved down your throat through these echo chambers. And this creates a kind of a moral inferiority, you know, when you see these huge numbers of people being massacred, and you know within yourself it is totally unacceptable and wrong. You know that within yourself. You are hardwired to feel that. And yet, these governments, the colonizers who are the advocates of human rights, are the very people who are selling the weapons which burn children quicker today than they did yesterday. Just bring this to your focus and see how this colonization has actually got to the very root of what it means to be human. And this reduction in self-reduced sense of self, or no, maybe not self-reduced, a reductionist self, a reductionist materialist, in fact, meaningless. This life is a meaningless life. You may have all the money that you want, you may have all the titles you want, you may have all the followers and everything else that goes with it. But in reality, it is a meaningless life, because what you came here for, you forgot. Not did you just forget, you were deliberately taken off the path. And as a result of it, you were simply harvested in order for others to make the profit, while you sacrificed the most precious gift that you ever have, which is called life, in collecting trinkets. Hire jaisa jana, कौडी बदले जाए. So empires no longer wear crowns. They glow through your screen. They glow through your news channels. So I hope this has given us some kind of a insight into how this whole process works and how this whole process has worked and is working. And the next talk I would like to focus on is going to be looking at how Gurmat therapy has demonstrated over this last 7 years that it has been able to decolonize the Sikh mind, or decolonize not the mind of a Sikh, S-I-K-H, but also decolonize a Sikh mind, S-I-C-K. A mind that has been colonized is a Sikh mind. And this has happened through creating a living mysticism, enabling that religion. Look, religions do not need to be removed. You need to see their role, but their role is superficial. The actual role is inner inquiry. So Gurmat therapy in particular has demonstrated itself to be highly effective in returning one's consciousness from belief to being, experiencing presence, experiencing stillness, experiencing silence. And through these experiences of stillness, silence, and presence and present moment, the alignment of the mind with the breath, awareness with the breath, with the breath, with the heart, heart with heart coherence, and then physiologically catalyzing your whole transpersonal growth. All of this has been demonstrated through the various dissertations that have demonstrated experientially, evidentially, and verifiably through qualitative research of individual mapping of their experience on a daily basis over a period of 2.5 years. So it's no longer an idea, it's now evidential. Uh, Core message is colonial conditioning reduced Gurmat to external performance, hierarchy, and identity. Gurmat therapy reawakens Guru consciousness. What does that mean? It's self-consciousness. The direct inner relationship with Hukam, present moment, moving you from self-actualization to self-realization to self-sovereignty. Reintegrating awareness, restoring ontological literacy. Ontological literacy is states and stages of consciousness, avastha, healing collective home, but also healing, or should I say transcending trauma, damaged sense of self, etc. And we have a number of dissertations that demonstrate how grief and trauma have been overcome through Gurmat therapy. And obviously, transcending this religious prison that we get caught into, which prevents us from seeing and acknowledging our whole experience, our real experience. And most importantly, reclaiming what I would call mystical agency, or Gurmat or Gurmukh Avastha, states and stages of being. I hope this has given us a little bit more insight into the continuation of how colonization happened and how it has been interfering with us right to this day. So the question is very simple. Do I continue to be a colonized subject, or do I awaken to the authentic pre-sectarian wisdom that Guru Nanak left for you and I? Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.